Okay.
Well, thank you. I just want to welcome everybody here this late Monday afternoon, rainy Monday afternoon. Thank you for coming over to the Atlantic Council. And first, I do want to thank the Atlantic Council for holding this event today. And also just want to, all of you here know that there's a report that's been put out, Moldova Strategy. If you haven't seen it, if you haven't picked up a copy, please do. So I want to just point out the two authors of the report who are here up on the stage with us today, and also thank Speaker Candu for being here as well. This is an important event and important time to focus on Moldova, and so I want to thank all of our speakers for today for being here to discuss this report, but also to discuss the relationship between the United States and Moldova as well, which is intertwined with any type of report, is looking at how Western partners, important Western partners in Moldova, including the United States, European Union, and international financial institutions, look at Moldova. And my name, for all of you who don't know me, is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, working both on their Eastern Europe and working on their democracy and civil society programs at GMF. And previously, before that, I had the honor to serve as the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Europe and Eurasia at USAID, overseeing our assistance programs in Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, and across Europe and Eurasia. And I see some colleagues, former colleagues in the crowd here as well, which is great to see them here. And one of the things that when I was working on these programs was seeing, spending a lot of time in Chisinau and here in Washington focused on Moldova's transition. And I came in shortly before the DCFTA and association agreement with Moldova was signed with the European Union, and saw a lot of the progress that was taking place on the ground, but also some of the challenges as well to that transition and to Moldova's efforts to become strengthened democracy and a full-fledged member of the Euro-Atlantic community. So fast forward, we're here, it's 2018, and some of the same challenges that existed even when I started working on these programs in 2014 exist today. And I think the conversation we're about to have is to really look at those challenges. I want to, again, point out the authors of this report, too, have laid out not necessarily a roadmap, but suggestions in terms of how Moldova can move forward in terms of its democracy and strengthen engagement with the West. And I did want to say that there is a backdrop to all of this, too. And I think it's one that it's really important for us to be thinking about when we think about this particular relationship, is some of the challenges over the last couple of months, too. And I think particularly the judicial ruling in Moldova for the Chisinau mayor elections, which for many in the United States was incredibly problematic and disconcerting. But I know some of those issues will be addressed. But also the upcoming parliamentary elections, which are certainly on everyone's radar here. And having been through elections in Moldova before, working on the U.S. government side, how important this period is and how important it will be to ensure that these elections are free, fair, and transparent. And I think it's particularly important right now because as the U.S. looks ahead and looks at its relationships, it has to factor in the progress being made, and so does the EU as well. And I think if we were honest here at this moment in time, it's a particularly challenging one for U.S.-Moldova relations. But I think there's opportunity, obviously, to get things on track, address some of the difficult challenges, and make sure that the opportunities aren't missed. And I know for the Moldovan people and public, and I've seen polling numbers, still suggest that there's a strong desire to engage and to join the Euro-Atlantic community in a more significant way. I think the major challenge is whether or not the government and governments in Moldova are prepared to carry out those reforms and to do so in a way that will truly advance the interests of the Moldovan people. So we're here today to have a full-blown conversation. And I will say this, obviously Moldova is not only challenged by sort of internal issues, whether it's Transnistria or issues of energy or economic growth, or the fact that I believe a third of the country, third of the population is living outside of the country, but also faces the challenge of Russia and Russian efforts on disinformation. And when I was working on at USAID, we worked on a number of programs to help transition Moldova's economy to better support its integration with Europe's economy. And this included in the agriculture sector, wine and vine, the wine sector as well, and a lot of success. And I always took away that Moldovans are entrepreneurial, incredibly smart, capable, and from our estimation, the future for Moldova is Europe, and that's got to be the focus. So, however, partners of Moldova can support and work with Moldovans to make sure that future becomes a reality should be a priority both for the United States and the EU. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to turn it over to the speakers for this event. And I'm just going to, most of you know the speakers up here, but I want to just talk to Dr. Anders Östlund, who's to my left, who is the Senior Fellow in the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. He also teaches at Georgetown University, a leading specialist on economic policy in Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. He's also served as an economic advisor to a number of governments. I think one of the smartest voices in Washington, especially on economics in this region and politics as well. So great to have you here. Congratulations on your report. Speaker Candu, thank you for being here as well. You were elected chairman of the Parliament of Moldova in January 2015. Prior to your election, you served as a member of Parliament from 2010 to 2013, Deputy Speaker of the Parliament, as Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Economy of the Republic of Moldova from 2014 to 2015. You also have extensive private sector experience as well, and we appreciate you being here today for this conversation. To his left is, we have Timothy Fairbank, he's all the way at the end. He's also one of the co-authors of the report, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. From 2008 to 2016, he was the original founder and managing director of Development Transformations, where he oversaw and managed the organization's governance, civil society, analytical, and elections programs throughout the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and Africa. He was also, prior to that, he spent a decade at NDI, including, my understanding is you were the first NDI country director for Moldova. Thank you for being here. And Karina Rebega, who is with SIPA, and this is the Center for European Policy Analysis. Thank you for being here. You also have an incredibly extensive background and history working in this region. I think you're the director of the U.S.-Romania Initiative and the Center's programming on democracy and the rule of law in Central and Eastern Europe. You're also working, I think, focused intently on the issue of disinformation as a SIPA and as writ large, and you're currently contributing to SIPA's StratCom program. So I think for this conversation today, which is looking at not only sort of the internal challenges in Moldova in this report, but the external as well, we really appreciate your participation today. What I want to do now is turn it over to the authors of the report. And Tim, if I could just turn to you just to talk about the key findings of the report and the political landscape that you're seeing and some of the suggestions. And then we're going to turn to Anders to talk a little bit more about the economic suggestions in this report and how to further strengthen Moldova's economy.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. My name is Tim Fairbank. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, and thanks for coming today to talk about the political and economic situation in Moldova. I think everyone knows here that these are difficult times in Moldova. We're only a few years after some major corruption and fraud scandals. And on the positive aspect, on the optimistic side, I think it's important to note that the government has made some modest, some solid changes in the economic areas. They've achieved, I think, some economic growth that last year was roughly 4.5%. From what I saw something today that said that over the last 12 months, it's actually tracking at 5.2%. So this economic growth and economic stabilization is, I think, an important thing to note. I'm going to be a little bit more critical on talking about the political side of things. I think the recent mayoral election in Chisinau is a good indicator and a good example that many, many and major reforms need to be taken in the political and judicial areas. I think after I speak, Anders will talk about some of these economic reforms that have taken place, and these reforms were taken after what we saw in 2014, which was the stolen $1 billion or the missing billion that was equal to roughly 1/8 of the GDP of Moldova. So 13% of Moldova's GDP was stolen from 3 key banks. At roughly the same time, there was also the money laundering scheme where we saw at least 20 billion, if not more, $20 billion go from Russian banks through Moldovan banks and on to Latvia and other places. We do talk about some of the loopholes that have been closed that will perhaps stop some of this, some of these financial dealings in the future. But I do want to point out that I find it troubling that some of the major players in the stolen $1 billion, some of the key individuals have not been brought to justice, and suspicions remain that some of these individuals are still in the country. Regarding Moldova's international agreements, one very positive development is, Jonathan mentioned the EU Association Agreement. Moldova's, the EU Association Agreement and the DCFTA went into force in 2016. And since that time, we've seen, I think, a shift and an increase of exports to the European Union. Russia is no longer Moldova's major trading partner. It is now the EU. And I think it's in 2017, it was roughly 65% of Moldova's exports went to the EU. So I think that's a solid development. In the years to come, we should see, I hope, more growth triggered from this agreement. And as Moldova gets integrated into the European supply line, we hope that the economy will grow with that. I think despite these gains on the economic side, I find that the political sector is really troubling. In my opinion, there's a lack of a really true independent free press. There's no independent judiciary, and power is in the hands of just a few elites. Going back to last summer, or just a few months ago, to me it's the annulment of what were seemingly free and fair elections to the Chisinau mayor elections really summarizes or highlights the 2 most pressing needs for Moldova today, and that's dramatic reform in the political and judicial areas. The winner of the election was Andrei Năstase, and the decision to annul the results were made first by a lower court, and then it was upheld by the Supreme Court. Shortly after the Supreme Court made this decision, or upheld the decision, the European Union announced that it was suspending 100 million euros of macro financial assistance to Moldova. From my understanding, the EU will not disperse more funds until after the parliamentary elections, if and when Moldova shows some signs that they're meeting democratic conditions. I think we talk about this in our report at the end of the introduction, but Moldova, in light of all of this, Moldova really faces 3 different paths that it could follow. We talk about path 1 being an oligarch-led quasi-authoritarian direction with declining democratization and more isolation from international partners. Path number 2, direction number 2, would be a leaning to Russian interests. It was sort of a Russian-controlled country, or Russian-influenced country, probably under control of the Socialist Party of Moldova. Option number 3, path number 3, and I think this is what the path that we want, I think it's the path that the government wants, is a free, a democratic, Western-leaning path with democratic institutions, an adequate judiciary, adequate press, and other political conditions. I think in light of the annulment of the mayoral elections and some other decisions that have been taking place, it looks like Moldova is leaning or has taken a step or two under path one. On the other hand, economically, I think economically they're going in the right direction. Economically, Moldova has chosen this path three, this democratic Western leaning path. But judicially and politically, it doesn't seem it's going in that direction. Sort of in closing these opening remarks, I think it's important to highlight that over the last few months, we've seen Moldovan citizens exercising their right to peacefully protest, voicing their opinion, and I think this is a positive development. I think the role of civil society is one of the bright spots in Moldova, and I hope these voices continue to gather, and I hope people take part of the political process. And lastly, I'll just say for the international community in the coming months, I think it's very important that the international community remains engaged and continues to support Moldova, that they continue to support civil society development, programs related to voter education, reforming the judiciary, and any programs that lead to sort of everything surrounding the election monitoring and pre-election monitoring programs. So. With that, I'll stop, and Anders, thank you.
Anders.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that Moldova has actually done a very nice turnaround. So we have this frightful night in November 2014. $1 billion disappears through 3 banks. What do you do then? You are lost. And for 1 year, 2015, Moldova had 4 governments, and no policy was really developed. It was a suitable chaos. After such an event, you should be in shock. And Moldova was in shock. After that, what happened? We got in January 2016 the new government of Pavel Filip as prime minister, and we get quite a different government with young technocrats, with speaking good English and having good education and having worked substantially in Western enterprises or institutions. So it's quite a different phase of Moldova. So what do people do first when they get into their offices? They clean up. So what Moldova did, reduced from a rather normal 16 ministries to 9 ministries, and cut all kinds of bureaucracy basically by 2/3. And that's exactly what is needed, and we can see the result of that in the World Bank Doing Business Index, that Moldova rose from already decent 63rd place in 2015 to 44th place this year. That is quite substantial and quite an improvement, but it is an administrative improvement. You ask then the more profound question, what happened to corruption? And here we have Transparency International, who offers a very different picture. It sees Moldova falling from 102nd place in 2015 to currently 122nd place. You wonder, how can this hang together? Well, because you have vested interest. The vested interest makes sure that the society, the machinery functions better, but that a larger share of the benefits go to them. So it's not contradictory. We are actually seeing a similar picture in quite a few post-Soviet countries, but still, this is a good start. And then what is needed is what Tim said here, judicial reform and a certain sorting out of a democratic process. Then, of course, you ask, how do we get there? And Tim already told you the answer. There is one institution that knows how to build rule of law and democracy, and that's the European Union. All the countries that have become members of the European Union had to become democracies according to the Freedom House ranking before they became members, and they have got decent rule of law, even if there are a few complaints about some of the countries, particularly Bulgaria and Romania, but when you see, they are not worse than Greece or Italy. So it's not all bad, but it's not good enough. And this is the way to follow. How do you get there? Well, you get a free trade agreement, you get an association agreement. This is exactly what Moldova has since 2016. Then they mentioned 100 billion euro in macro-financial assistance. Is that a lot of money? No, it's far too little. The European needs to engage more. And you can see now the countries in Eastern Europe that has become members of the European Union, they get typically 3% of GDP each year in grants. This is a massive flow. And for such money you have to perform. You have to perform the sufficient reforms. So what we want to see, it is that the European Union engages more. And the very positive side of this is what has happened to trade. That in 2000, I was quite in despair, only 20% of Moldova's exports went to the European Union. Why? Well, at that time Moldova was primarily an agricultural exporter, and the European Union is not very fond of agricultural imports. And that did not work out very well. But now, two big things have happened. One is that Moldova has got substantially more foreign direct investment, so that Moldova now produces quite a lot of machinery that is being sold to the European Union, where you don't have any particular barriers for trade. And Moldova is now producing more processed foods, for which EU protectionism is relatively mild. I've looked previously at the countries that have become members of the European Union, and where do you see a turnaround? Well, when 2/3 of the exports go to the European Union, Moldova is almost there with 64 or 65%. So I think that we should look upon it as a further integration and getting closer. So what is the threat? Well, has already been mentioned, Russian corruption, because Russian trade is unfortunately also corruption. And this is a big concern. Tim mentioned the money laundering problem. Hopefully that has been sorted out now. The IMF has gone very hard at it, and knock wood, there's no wood here, but it seems that it has been cleared out. And these three banks have been cleaned out and sorted out. Russia today is not an alternative. 40% of Moldova's exports goes to Russia, and we have steady problems that we are discussing in the report. I'll not mention them here, with the gas trade, which is a persistent problem in all post-Soviet countries, that Russia utilizes Gazprom not as a commercial organization, but as a combined geopolitical weapon and a machinery of corruption for the Kremlin elite. And this is what one wants to avoid. So as it is today, Russia does not offer a fair alternative. And therefore, to me, it seems that Moldova is on the right track, in spite of these problems as the mayoral election. And the key thing, property rights. In the former Soviet Union, I would argue that it's only Georgia that has, in a real sense, property rights today. In all other post-Soviet countries, the property rights are pretty weak. Moldova is on the better half of them, but that's not good enough. So the property rights have to be strengthened. And that requires that you have an independent judiciary and a strong prosecutorial power. Leave that to the European Union. The European Union knows how to get it done. And then all the problems are over, and it's only a question of a long period of growth. What that means in numbers, Moldova now has 4.5% to 5% growth. It should be 8% growth, because Moldova is integrated with countries that have much higher economic level. How do you get there? Well, you get more investment. Moldova has now an investment quota of just over 20%. It should be 30% for a country like Moldova, that requires both heavy investment in infrastructure and in production. And let us hope that Moldova continues on this track. Thank you.
Great. Speaker, the floor is yours to respond to Anders and Tim and the report.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, we'd like to thank and to express our appreciation for the work was done for the report. Thank you very much for the authors, and again appreciations and express the gratitude for the Atlantic Council to host such nice event. I think it's already the second or the third time I'm here, and it's indeed very interesting to talk about Moldova and about the region. Well, there are many issues which are I would debate and challenge, maybe, which are in the report, but in order to understand the entire situation, we have to put Moldova in time. Have a line and see where we are in 1990s, at the beginning, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Then in 2009, I would say, when there were so big and high expectations, when the communist government fell and the new pro-European parties came into power. Then a big blow in what means the banking fraud in 2014, and a disaster, as you said, in 2015 with 4 governments in 1 year, and which had an impact also on the economy and the political life, as well as on the social area. And then a period of, I would say, a period of recovery, a period of stabilization, and the first signs of growth, because that's the most important. After such big expectations of 2009, it came this failure with the banking crisis in 2014. And actually, things happened not over one night. As you said, 1 billion was stolen in one night, in that November. This happened in years, unfortunately, vested interests in the banking financial sector, and influencing also from the Russian investors, and that was also the roots and the origin of the money laundering issues. More than $24 billion being laundered from through Moldova from the banking sector and using the judicial power. And then, as a consequence, even the European Union reputation fell and it was damaged, because in December 2015, January 2016, if you would look and analyze the figures of the surveys, you would see that it fell to 40 or even 35% of reputation in terms of perception of the population about European Union. And that's because, unfortunately, the political leaders with the European flag were failing in expectations. Then the government in 2016, January, came the new government, and you properly mentioned about the goals and strategies at that time to clean the system, to make the government more efficient, to make the institutions which were so weak, to strengthen the institution and to have powerful institutions, so really it can, the situation can be stabilized, can be recovered. And the first goal was to recover the banking financial sector. And really it was a tremendous titanic work with IMF partner and World Bank as well, with their experience, with their knowledge, going through legislation, systemic approach. The system was cleaned completely. And as a consequence, today we have a banking sector which is becoming, I would say, 90% foreign investment, being owned by foreign investors. In just a couple of weeks, we will have a new transaction, and finally also the American capital will be in the banking sector. And that was the goal, to recover from what was the cause, to treat that cause, and to have afterwards the recovery. Better institutions mean efficiency. Efficiency means the results in including the revenues for the country, for the budget. By properly cutting the corruption cases from the tax authorities, from the custom authorities, for what means public procurement. Effectively, we have a revenue increase for close to 30% for these years. Because when to fight against corruption, we can come with a couple of approaches. The first is prevention. It's less costly and more efficient to prevent corruption. And for this, Parliament as well as the government came with the legislation called Integrity Package, where more than 60,000 of individuals, civil servants and officials, those who hold official positions, are yearly coming with public statements showing, disclosing the properties, the revenues, the source of revenues, and of course they even charges and criminal charges if they mislead or they come with wrong information. This is part of the prevention. And as well as to fight against corruption, and in order to fight against corruption is to look where there are vested interests. And the corruption is there. We know everybody that it's the big vulnerability is where the public funds are. And then when you have public funds, it's about public procurement, it's about the custom authorities, because we have custom duties, we have excises, and then of course the tax administration. Well, through different mechanisms, including the legislation, we have managed to cut many cases of the corruption and to charge those involved in the corruption scheme. So in this way, we have achieved the results of having the growth in the revenues of the country, which then you have money to spend on salaries, on pensions, on infrastructure, and even to increase the revenue of the population, which for the last 2 years it happened, I would say, never in the history we had in 2 years increase of the salaries and revenues of population more than 30%. And this is really an achievement. Of course, there are challenges. And the biggest challenge, I would say, looking for the entire process from the legislation to the implementation, it's about the lack of human resources in terms of knowledge and experience. We can be the best in working and approving the legislation. And we have examples of the legislation in energy industry, in the banking financial sector, including judiciary system and reforms. And when it comes for the implementation, then we have problems. Slow process, lack of understanding, and then it's about people. It's about the lack of resources to retain good people, to keep them in the country, or to educate and to train the new generation. And therefore, this is a challenge that we have really to think about in the future. And as the priority is already set up, the first priority, number one, for the next period of time, for 5 years, for 10 years, is the human capital and education. This should be the priority for the country. Otherwise, we can be so good in planning, we can be so good in vision, and have this vision if we don't have people for the implementation. Of course, what was set up as the priorities in January 2016 by the new government, the new coalition, I would say that almost all of those priorities were partially or fully accomplished in terms of, and many on economic issues, because the economy is the engine and it's a push then for other as the consequence. If you have good economy, if you have jobs, if you have salaries, if you have revenues, then it's much, much easier then to handle other issues, including the judiciary reform, which is, I would say, the biggest problem and the biggest headache which is giving to any of being the governing the country. Biggest challenge, I would say the political challenge, is of course the elections. Upcoming parliamentary elections. They are set up for the 24th of February next year. And the most important, as you were mentioning as well, rightly, is to secure and ensure that we have fair, true, legal elections. What happened with local elections in Chisinau, I would say it came like a blow up for the political class and for everybody, because there was a damage for the government, there was a damage for the image of the country, there was a damage for the ruling party, because the Democratic Party fell around 3 or 4% in the polls because of what happened with the local elections. Now in the parliament there is an investigation, and there are hearings organized starting from the last week, gathering the information and data what happened. I can have my personal opinion and comment on the court's decision. It was right, it was bad. As the lawyer and the graduate in the law faculty, I learned one important rule. When there is a court decision, you take it as it is, it's executable, and that's the law. Then you look for the legislation and to find the gaps and loopholes in the legislation and to fix it. Well, I was surprised to find last week that in Moldova we had 37 cases before when the courts cancelled or annulled the legislation because of the breach of the legislation by the candidates or for different other reasons. It's good or it's bad, so I don't know. Now it's difficult to say, but the Nastase case is not the only one case. Of course, it came as a big sign and a message that something is wrong, including in the legislation, because it's about the city hall, because it's about the capital of the country. It was a breach of the law or not, courts decided. Now it's about the legislation as well to fix those loopholes in terms of behavior during the silent day, behavior during it's how to campaign or not to campaign during the day of elections, how about using the social networks and about internet. I can tell you that a couple of countries in the region now really have a headache, and now they are looking for solutions on how to prevent the interference in the elections because of internet and because of the social networks. Our Latvian colleagues, they organize investigations, and they are in discussions with Facebook, with Twitter, and also with their Russian social networks. Our Estonian colleagues just recently had a delegation, a visit from Estonian Parliament. They also have upcoming elections in the beginning of 2019, so they're also thinking about, because this is really something which we never were thinking before, how important can be for the elections. In Moldova legislation, we don't have anything about the social networks, anything about the live broadcasting during silent day or during the day of elections. So this is something that we have to handle. This is something that we have to fix, to find solutions so we can secure and ensure, as you were mentioning, that the upcoming elections in February, and not only, because then we used to organize the elections in May or June, local general elections, so for all the local communities, for all local authorities. As I was mentioning, the biggest or the most complex reform which is still delaying in the implementation in the process, this is about the judiciary system. Because of the judiciary system, we had the problems with the money laundering scheme. Because of the judiciary system, we had not yet solved all the cases for the banking fraud of 2014. So unfortunately, this takes time, because it's about also educating the new generation of judges. Now we are thinking about some intermediary solutions. We saw some of examples in the regions. We have spoken also with international partners, stakeholders like EBRD, so they could come with support also in terms of experience and knowledge in creating alternatives, solutions for the current judiciary system that we have in Moldova. First is to introduce mandatory binding the mediation before the court itself. And second, also like in some of the countries in the Middle East or Kazakhstan recently also were thinking about introducing English law system with English courts and the decisions to be binding, forcible in the country when it comes business to business relations or business to with authorities, towards the authorities when it comes for the business regulations like tax authorities, regulations, or whatever authorities handling the relationship. So there are still many issues to solve. In some of the areas we were more successful, in many of the economic areas. In some of them less successful. Still, all of us would like to speed up in many areas. Finally, we have managed to launch important projects. It's about the legislation, it's about the system itself, but also the infrastructure projects for securing the country from an energy point of view. Mm-hmm. And that's about gas pipe from Romania to Moldova with reverse flow, as well as interconnection with the European Union through Romania, called back-to-back system, when it's about the electricity because of different frequencies. And this is a big jump. This is really a big development. It's also economic project which will generate jobs and economic growth, but as well as the security of the country. Media, mass media, civil society, it's also on the agenda of the political agenda. This year in the Parliament we have managed to set up a working group with the civil society and experts in the mass media, so to work on the new legislation which could give a big push in development also for the outlets, TV outlets, radio outlets in Moldova, and also to secure the country against the propaganda, disinformation, by prohibiting to be broadcasted the Russian products, and to attract foreign investors. Therefore, we came with a solution like other countries, like called cash rebate. So the country pays back the investors or part of the investments from the foreign investors. And you law on the civil society. Now we are discussing in the Parliament to encourage more, so to focus on development, because we need civil society. It's a very important, I would say, watchdog for what the government is doing, on what generally the power is doing, and this is also important. Still many things to do, but the most important challenge, the upcoming parliamentary elections. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. I know there's going to be a lot of follow-up questions, also responding to some of the things you said, and I think, I do have to think that what you mentioned about the Chisinau mayoral election in terms of impact, I think it's probably, in the time that I've worked on Moldova, it was probably the most significant impacting event on how people in Washington are looking at Moldova. I want to say it's a particularly, that's why I think it's a particularly challenging moment, and want to put that in the proper context, and that's why the upcoming elections, it's not only about free, fair elections, it's about even the lead up to that, to whether you have a level playing field. You mentioned independent media, which we know there isn't, that independent media in Moldova struggles, but it's also about the actual modalities leading up to this election as well. And if you look at polling numbers too, it's certainly a challenging polling numbers for the current ruling party, and I'm curious when we get to this, and Corinne, I'll turn to you next too, is how do you intend to, if the numbers look where they are right now, how do you intend to reverse that? What are the things? I mean, if you look at the polling and what Moldovans want, they want corruption solved, they want a strengthened relationship with the West. Not all. It's there's definitely some divides within society, and that's a challenging process. But I'm interested in hearing more about that, because I think what you're talking about in terms of looking at the future, if Moldovans are leaving the country, or they feel like they don't feel comfortable, or they don't feel confident in the system itself, then it's going to be really hard to reach the full potential that you talked about, even with human resources. And so that's an issue. And that type of trust from society, a buy-in to the future, is critical, especially for smaller countries that are challenged economically. And Moldova still reaches those challenges. Can I turn to you next to respond to some of the conversation here, the report, also to some of the things that the speakers has talked about?
Sure, thanks, Jonathan, and thank you for the invitation. I think it's really great that we try to keep the expert community focused on Moldova. I think it speaks to the relevance of the country in a regional context. And I think it also speaks to our success, or maybe lack of success, in kind of promoting the values that the Euro-Atlantic community is founded upon. And I think I wouldn't be a good Eastern European if I weren't a little pessimistic. So please allow me to be a little bit pessimistic and first say to the report that Tim and Anders have authored, that I absolutely agree with how you identify the main challenges and some of the main recommendations. And I think everybody, Mr. Speaker, you as well, agree that judicial reform and corruption and some international analysis would even claim that we're actually seeing state capture. It's not just pervasive corruption. This is the main challenge that the Moldovan system of governance is facing right now. And secondly, because I referenced independent analysis, both from, let's say, Moldovan civil society, but also reputable international institutions, and I'm talking here about the World Bank, the IMF, European Commission, as well as some of the international NGOs. I recently read something on the Bertelsmann Stiftung on Moldova. They seem to contrast quite significantly with what we're seeing from your assessments coming from Chisinau. And I think while there have been improvements, and we see the results, especially after the big $1 billion theft scandal, it still seems not to be enough. And there is a perceived disenchantment on behalf of the Western community as to whether Moldovan elites are committed to the path that they've set themselves onto. And this is really crucial because, and your report is talking about it, and a lot, some of the international officials in Chisinau have talked about the need for more engagement, the need for more expertise. I think we've seen a lot of that. I think Moldova has received a lot of expertise, good expertise. It has written up a lot of good laws. But when it comes to implementing them and the spirit of those reforms, and you've also talked about that, Moldova is lacking a lot. And if you take kind of a bigger view, a bigger perspective on the issues, not focusing on the small reforms that seem to have worked in the past few months or couple of years, I think at a systemic level, structural reforms are still lacking, are still not where they're supposed to be. And the major part in that, Jonathan, you spoke about trust. It's society's trust in the functioning of public institutions and the judiciary, and I think that's missing to a terribly worrisome extent. And again, mistrust from Moldova's international partners. And this can hurt Moldova in the short run and in the long run, as we have seen with freezing of much needed funds and so on. So, talking about rule of law reforms, this is something that is particularly dear to me, and I believe is the foundation of every strong state. You have a lot of new legislation, good legislation, inspired by international experts, and a lot of money and good work being put into the system and setting up new institutions to fight corruption, to prevent corruption, like the Integrity Authority. But then there's, and this is quite quite confusing, I have to say, and perhaps you can help us with a little bit more insight from Chișinău. You have then legislation that tends to roll back on all of the good work that has been done. And I'm referring here, for instance, to the recent, well, I guess not so recent law on fiscal amnesty that has the potential to undermine the work that Moldovan authorities have done to uncover the authors of the $1 billion theft, but also impair your ability to recover these assets, which are crucial for Moldova, and also clean some other money with a potential there of turning Moldova into some sort of offshore type of country in a complicated region. We don't want to see that. So that's I think, to a certain extent, a typical path for Central and Eastern Europe, including for countries that are now members of the EU, where you see a range of good reforms, most of them implemented or created, written up, better said, as a result of the pressure of the European Union or the IMF and so on. But then you see a measure that undercuts all of this effort and rolls it back to time zero and destroying all of the good work that has been done. And I would also like to add to that, we've referenced some of the main scandals in the financial sector in Moldova. There's also energy sector, and all of you have mentioned how crucial that is in reducing Moldova's dependence on Russian gas. But there's a corruption element there too, or a captive institution type of situation there too, with a lot of bad energy deals that are hurting Moldovan society, are hurting the Moldovan state budget, and are hurting the credibility of its state institutions by allowing all sorts of energy schemes to launder money, to allow offshores to penetrate the market, to impose undue tariffs, to extract undue revenues, and so on. And this makes Moldova more vulnerable, not just to Russia, but just internally. It just weakens state institutions. So this is just to reinforce that it really takes, and we've seen that again, I need to reference countries that have become members of the EU in the past 10 years. It really needs to go to the root of the problems, to the cause of the problems, as you said, Mr. Speaker. And that may not be the lack of human resources only. It may also be, and please contradict me if I'm wrong, a lack of political will. We've seen that across the region. When you have the nice reforms, ticking all the boxes that the international community wants to see, but then we don't see commitment to actually fundamentally restructure governance principles, institutions, the political behaviors, administrative behaviors, and so on, that would make reforms sustainable in the long run. So I think that is a major problem, a major issue that Moldova will have to confront. Same with other countries. And that comes before anything else. And I'll stop here, and I'm happy to challenge you some more if you'll allow me later.
Oh, well, thank you for that. And one of your first points was about the importance of the focus of partners of Moldova in terms of Europe and the United States, which I did. It's important to point out. Obviously, there's a great deal of focus, but it hasn't the sustained engagement at the highest level. Has been lacking, and if I had any criticism of sort of even from the U.S. side, is not a high enough level attention to engagement, and I think that's challenging. The resources have certainly been there on the U.S. side, the funding through assistance for many of the reforms that you talked about, we're all talking about here today, and are there for the implementation of reforms which take both, as you said, both political will and also the technical capacity over an extended period to actually to carry out. And if at any point during that process you lose that political will or you don't have the technical capacity, you can see setback. And I think the goal is to have those long-term commitments be there from partners, which I think is there only when you run into these run into these situations, or perception is the political will isn't there. So, Speaker, I wanted to give you the floor to respond to some of both the challenges and some of the points that have been raised in conversation so far.
Thank you. We'll accept the challenge, and I would be more optimistic, because without optimism, and then definitely we don't have to do anything. It's just to shut ourselves somewhere in the dark and shoot ourselves with the pessimism. We live in a different and difficult region, and we have to understand that some of the countries build the institutions and the rules for hundreds of years, and we will only have 27 years of existence of this country, still with I would say Homo Sovieticus mind and mentality of part of the population, still with the nostalgia for the Soviet Union and difficulties in accepting the new challenges and the new way of being. We are talking about a new generation of young Moldovans who has the possibility to study outside of the country, gain experience, and maybe stay there outside of the country without coming back and participating or contributing for the development of the country. Different countries had such kind of path. Take Italy, for example, after the Second World War. How the north of Italy was living to different other countries in Europe or to United States, and the south of Italy was coming to the north. So there are processes, there are challenges, but definitely we have to be optimistic and work and work and work. When I was talking about the good legislation and problems in the implementation and lack of experience and lack of knowledge, let's talk about using facts. And I will give you an example. One of the most important tools and institution to fight against corruption, to prevent corruption, and that's about the National Integrity Agency. Within the National Integrity Agency, there is a function, there is a position of so-called inspectors of integrity. This agency is trying to recruit people to get in this work with such good salaries. It was unbelievable. Last week we organized hearings in the Parliament to see how this agency is working. And we were surprised to hear that for a junior position, which is paid for more than $1,000 per month, and this is a huge salary for Moldova, they don't have resources. They have less, well, there's a big interest, but people are afraid to come because there are tough conditions for the recruitment. Interviews, tests, which they have to pass, publicly broadcasted. Polygraph test, lie detector, which is again something that many of the people will not have courage to go. But if we want to build something really strong, there should be a way. We really need integrity officers or these inspectors really to be at the high level of the integrity and morality. And in order to have them, you have tough interviews, you have tough tests. So they are working from the entire capacity. They have only 30%, 30 from the entire the personnel that they need. And they still organize public interviews, they still put always the advertising for the recruitment, but people, they have reluctancy of going so. It's about the work, it's about to be publicly exposed, it's about their own integrity, it's about their own resources and revenues. So this is an example when we have a good legislation, when we had the political will, because we need the political will to the members of the parliament to vote in the parliament a law which will oblige all the members of the parliament to show all their revenues, all the patrimony, properties that they have, and not only their individual, but also up to the second grade of relatives. And not, when we're talking about real estate, we're not talking about the cars, we're talking about the jewelries, we're talking about watches, furnitures, whatever, which has a threshold. This is an example when a good legislation, a good will, a political will, and unfortunately delaying implementation because of the lack of the resources. You're talking about the energy. If there would not be a will for a political will to really cut the vested interest and to cut the dependency for Moldova, then we would not pass in the parliament difficulties. I would say difficult and very complex laws related to the energy. Currently today, we have almost 18 to 19% of the entire capacity is the renewable energy already. Now all the distributors and the suppliers, they are obliged to buy from any of the individuals who produce renewable energy. Binding. We would not ask Transgaz, which is a Romanian entity, listed entity with shareholders as EBRD, to come to Moldova and buy the pipe, buy the company, and to start investing in the company. If there would be vested interest, if there would not be interest in fighting against corruption, we would not have results in the economy as we had, because it's about the public funds, it's about the liberalization, the industries, the economy itself. Of course, there are huge problems in many other areas, but it's about time. It's about time, engagement, and of course, positive approach and optimism.
Do you want to respond back?
And speaking about the support of the foreign partners, of course, and the United States plays a very important role. Could play more, I would say, deeper engaging in the processes. And I will give you an example. For the last 3 years, if I'm not wrong, Ambassador, maybe you will help. For the last 2 years, we did not have any of the meetings for the strategic dialogue that normally we should have. And internal domestic issues in the United States or in Moldova should not stop us in having the dialogue on defense, on education, on infrastructure. United States is strategic partner for Moldova, reliable partner, and one of the most important partners. More than $1 billion were invested in different programs. At the same time, disengagement of United States, of European Union, and other international partners like IMF, World Bank, EBRD, this will really damage the country. Engagement, strong engagement, irrespective of the domestic issues and processes. Because ultimately, we're not talking about Andrian Candu as the Speaker of the Parliament. We're talking about processes in the country which will help the population of the country. That's the support for Moldova and its own people. And it's not about the political stakeholders or the current rulers.
Tim, and then we're going to turn to everyone here if you have any questions. But Tim.
Yeah, I just have a few more things to say. I mean, I want to be clear. I don't think Moldova's on the right track. I think there are a lot of problems, and they're not on the right track. We talked about, you mentioned like looking at the timeline over the years, the 90s, the 2000s, and what's taken place in Moldova. We've never had an election just canceled and annulled by this. Moldova is actually, we mentioned in the report, compared to its neighbors, the elections over its history, over its 27 years now, they've been pretty good. There's never been worries like there are now. There's never been an election that's been canceled. Moldovan elections have been quite good. During the 2000s, when President Voronin of the Communist Party was in power, communist power, but pro-European for the most part, the elections were solid, the elections were good. I was there. I monitored many of them. I was there in the pre-election and post-election phase. The elections there were good. You know, I don't think the country is seriously fighting corruption. We talk about the missing billion and any steps that have been made for that, but the businessman and politician Ilan Shor is responsible for a lot of that money. Is Ilan Shor in jail today? No, he's an active mayor. He does what he pleases. The government kind of allows him to set up a counter protest to the protests that we saw a few weeks ago. So it's hard to talk about being serious about fighting corruption when there's examples like this, if we're just sticking to the facts. And lastly, I think the immigration issue is a big concern, and certainly, for 20 plus years, people have been leaving Moldova. It's tough. The economy is tough. People are going. But I think people in Moldova need to see more reason to stay or more reason to come back home. And I think if you look over the last couple of years, look at the figures of the amount of people applying for Romanian citizenship, I think that spiked quite high over the last couple of years. So that's a little bit of a concern. And I'll leave it like that, but I guess one other comment, and Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, but I don't think you can say because of the judicial system we had the money laundering scheme. I mean, because of criminal activity, you had the money laundering scheme. Because of actions that people did, you had money laundering. It wasn't because of the judicial system. Thank you.
Okay.
If you would allow just a couple of words. The judicial system was used for the money laundering. Because money went from Russian Federation through Moldova based on the judicial decisions, court decisions. That was the cause, and that was the reason why Moldova was used, because of the judicial system, because of the courts. It was everything based on decisions of the judges of the courts. And consequently afterwards, after investigations, today we have 15 judges and many prosecutors being under the investigation. When I didn't know, when I was telling you, I was surprised to find that we had 37 cases of annulment of local elections in Moldova. We should go deeper in analysis and see. On one side, we want to have a rule of law and to respect the law. On another side, someone, which now I don't come now as a judge to judge a case and to blame that someone is guilty or not. But the court said that it was a breach of legislation by the candidates, and if we're talking about the breach of legislation, that's the rule of law. That's the rule of law we should respect. It's under the investigation, it's under the hearings in the parliament, so we'll see what is the result of this investigation. And when talking about the so-called stolen billion case, we have more than 45 criminal cases. We have more than 55 people, individuals, under the investigation, some of them detained, some of them already condemned. We have, that's what the prosecutor says, and that's what they will also set up in their strategy for the recovery of the assets. 90% of assets are already traced. Now it's about the process of recovery. And when we are talking about recovery, then we have different jurisdictions, then we have different procedures like regulatory commissions and many other things. Things are happening. Yes, maybe slower than we expect. It is true. You give the case of Ilan Shor. He got the first decision from the court. Well, based on the Moldovan legislation, which is just as in other European countries, the first decision is not executable. So you cannot stop a person and put him in a jail just because of the first decision. It should be the second one at the Court of Appeal. Otherwise, we will be blamed and we'll lose the case at the the Court of Human Rights because we breached the Article 7 fair trial. Well, we have to put in balance. Maybe I don't like Mr. Shor as well, and I don't like what he is doing and how he is promoting himself. But shall we change the legislation because of Mr. Shor? And speaking about the protests, in Moldova we have one of the most liberal legislation of protests. And the authorities cannot intervene in allowing someone or not allowing someone to organize protests. The authorities should, if there are 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of them organized, should secure the area so they don't interfere and they don't fight against each other. That's the Moldovan legislation, which was assessed as one of the best legislations by the Council of Europe. And that's the freedom of expression, and that's the freedom of protest. Should Moldovan authorities tell to one or to another, don't organize protests just because we don't like this or we don't like that? That will be interference. Thank you.
Okay. Well, why don't we open it up to the floor for questions? We have one over there in the corner. Please identify yourself and who you're affiliated with. And we'll take a couple together because I recognize the time is close to ending here. So why don't we take the 3 on that side, one row behind you, yes, and up front as well.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Alex Sanchez. I'm an analyst here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Speaker, since the 2016 attempted coup in Turkey, tens of thousands of Turkish nationals have been arrested, and even more civil servants, teachers, and have been fired. The Moldovan government has done its share in the crackdown in Turkey. Just a few days ago, 7 professors from the Horizont school in the capital were arrested and summarily deported to Turkey within only a couple of days. My question is why? Why were these people arrested? What specific charges were made against them? And what does it say? Was there even a trial before they were deported back to Turkey? And what does it say about the rule of law, transparency and democracy and judicial reforms in Moldova if the Moldovan government continues to carry out these actions? Thank you.
Why don't we take up in the front row?
Hi, Inga Afanasieva, citizen of Moldova. Just to follow up on that, I'd like to ask Mr. Candu, in his conversations with the American counterparts here, how you are going to present the case of the 7 Turkish teachers that have been extradited to Turkey, and are you aware of the fact that although they're suspected of being associated with the Gulen movement, that actually Fethullah Gulen himself is exiled here in the US. He has not been extradited to Turkey. So what will be your story to tell the American counterparts, and how have you and our leadership respected the Constitution of Moldova, human rights of those individuals? And my second question is, I'm actually very appreciative of you bringing not only the optimistic side of what is happening to Moldova. Thank you, Tim, for bringing up the egregious violations that are happening in Moldova, and actually understanding that if things don't change now, they will get much worse. In that context, I'm curious about who funded the report itself, and if there was a request to do the report, who did it come from? Thank you.
And I think we have a gentleman right behind in the...
Yeah, hi, Bill Hill, currently of the Wilson Center, but having spent a little time in Moldova. I'd like to turn to a longer range question that I hear a little bit alluded to in Speaker Candu's remarks, but less so in the report, but which I think is, it's the question of human capital and the large continued dependence of the Moldovan economy on remittances. And it strikes me that Anders, and you can go back and look at this, at how this fits in. My experience in working in Moldova was certainly that the absence of personnel is a key factor, even if one has political will. And Mr. Speaker, you referred to that in terms of the anti-corruption agency. But I just wonder if, how with your other recommendations, with many of which I agree fully, how can you, what steps or what part of this can be used to provide incentive for the hundreds of thousands of Moldovans who have left over the past 20 years, working abroad, sending money back, upon upon whom the economy and the population in Moldova depend, and whose absence really is a severe limiting factor on all of the things that you're talking about that one wishes the Moldovan government to do in order to implement reform. Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we, Mr. Speaker, I think a few of the questions were directed to you on certainly the communities outside Moldovan community, and that the inability for them to impact what you want to do internally. If you could answer that question, and then also there was a question about Turkish citizens who were sent back to Turkey with what for some is perceived as being with a lack of judicial due process, which by the way hasn't been the only time this has happened in country in Europe as well. But you're best able to answer those questions, and if others want to jump in as well, please do. Human capital, okay.
Well, when just briefly speaking about the jobs, lack of skilled people, and what we try to do to retain people in the country or to create opportunities so we can have people for the jobs, which indeed we lack in some of the industries already. We lack the human resources. First of all, is to come with some exemptions, some programs, social programs, to retain people in the country. For the youth individuals and the young families, the government came with a, I would say, quite successful program like in Romania. Romanian experience is called the First House, where you really, the country is helping to have good conditions for the mortgages. So the young individuals and the families, they can buy their first house. Then other initiatives for the, now if someone comes to Moldova to set up the business, and if this is 100 jobs, then the country will come to cover the costs of those jobs for the 4 years' time. And many other exemptions and privileges to attract investors and to create jobs and to educate people to become more professional or specialized in some of the areas. And when it comes for the human capital and education, there is also quite a good program which now is developing more and more. It's called vocal education, when one individual can combine studies with work. It's a German system, as well as with the Germans now developed. So there are already a couple of the programs to help keep the people in the country, as well as to specialize them in different skills so they can fill in the jobs, which, by the way, there are quite good results. Speaking about the economy, last year there were created close to 60,000 new jobs, and that's an achievement. Speaking about the Turkish citizens, people are mixing up with the terms and legal framework. They were not arrested, they were not detained. These are the foreigners who were seeking for the asylum. The asylum was refused, and they were removed from the country. So there is a procedure for this. We have organized hearings in the Parliament, the first hearing. Still others will be organized to understand better the environment, the cause, and how everything was done. Based on the information from the intelligence agency, based on their information and their statements and with what they came during the hearings, they fulfill the legislation, and they were obeying all the rules for the so-called exposition. I can believe or I cannot believe. I can have my own opinion, but when it comes for what was said, security of the country, then you rely on the professionalism. Then you rely on the professional attitude, skills, and it's very important that Moldovan authorities, they respected the human rights and the legislation, domestic legislation, as well as the international legislation that Moldova is part of.
Anderson.
Yeah, let me take Bill Hill's question about immigration. This is a massive problem in many countries in Eastern Europe, Armenia, Georgia, Bulgaria, Moldova, Ukraine, the 3 Baltic states. Each of these countries have lost 1/4 to 1/3 of their populations since 1989, and it will get worse because of the massive differences in salaries. So in Moldova today, the average salary is below $300 a monthly salary, and then in an ordinary European country you get $2,000 or more per month. So we are seeing massive moves. For example, in Poland there are something like 2 million Ukrainians. Therefore the population is pretty stable, while 2 million Poles have left mainly to Britain and Germany. So we are seeing these moves everywhere, and you ask, when does it stop? When you get a sufficiently high salary.
Yeah.
That's the shocking answer. The country that seems to have come to an end of it is Estonia for the last 3 years, when the average salary has reached 1,500 euro. So this is a long way to go. Part of it will probably be through appreciation of currency, and part of it will be growth, and part of it will be higher inflation than other countries. So it's quite typical for a country like this to have a real appreciation of 20-25% a year, which makes it easier to catch up. But if you take the historical worst case, Ireland had massive immigration from 1847 to 1990. So these are things that take many years, but what typically then happens is that you get people coming from somewhere else. For example, you might have read in the New York Times, or was it the Financial Times the other day, that Poland is now getting a lot of Indians coming, working, and we are also seeing that students move. There are lots, I don't know how many thousand Moldovan students in Romania today. There are 40,000 Ukrainian students in Poland. So this is also part of it, and many will come back. And you mentioned the remittances that are an important part, because people can buy a house at home much more cheaply. Much of the remittances in these countries is typically coming from people who are intent on going back home, building a house and setting up a business, and then it's important that they have the opportunity to do so.
And Anders, if I can add to that too, obviously the attraction of the EU for that reason is particularly important for a country like Moldova. And of course Estonia became an EU member. And most of those countries, in fact all the countries that joined the EU, you saw significant economic growth. And you can't decouple it from political stability as well, democratic systems, and transparent judiciary. Although that still is a challenge, as we see even in those countries that have joined the EU. I think it's a forever challenge to make sure that democratic systems work.
But you have a problem. It's the people who like Europe who leave. So then you get fewer people who like Europe who stay. And that shows up in elections.
Did you want to add to that?
You made the exact point that I wanted to make. People need to feel invested in the system they live in, and I think especially for higher skilled individuals, it's not money that drives them out, is the perception of opportunity, of social justice, of independent institutions, and the general direction of the country, which unfortunately, as opinion polls show for Moldova, looks pretty dire. And this is a major issue for other countries as well, as you mentioned. But also, I think it's worth considering a little bit the policies towards the diaspora and how you keep people invested in their country of origin. And one of them is rebuilding trust in the institution, in the state they've left, and the other one is keeping them engaged in the political process. And I think the tendency is going counter to that. And we didn't get a chance to talk about the electoral law that the Moldovan parliament adopted last year, but this tends to limit the involvement of the diaspora in participating in the democratic processes in Moldova. It kind of limits other things as well and creates unfortunate opportunities for political forces in Moldova. But I think that this is a major issue, and this was, because we talked about legislation, this was created through legislation, unfortunately.
Exactly, to allow diaspora to have their own representatives for the first time in the history. This will create opportunity. Based on this system, there will be constituency here in the United States, and our Moldovan diaspora who lives here or in Canada will have their representative, will have their seat in the Moldova parliament. That's due to the new electoral system.
Yeah, I think there's a concern though that it dilutes the actual vote of the diaspora community, this large diaspora community, to funnel it into these few seats in Parliament rather than weighing in as part of the overall system. And I do think that if you're sitting from outside looking in, and you have a certain perspective of where you want to see the country go. Many of them are in the EU and want to see Moldova closer to the EU and integrated, and to complete the association process. They may look at that, at the new law, as being more restrictive, and I think that's worthwhile noting. As you're thinking about attracting that human capital back to Moldova, is exactly what was said, which is to attract them. Otherwise, it looks like it's an attempt to push them away. And that is how I've heard it from diaspora communities that I've talked to, is that they feel like it's pushing them away. So why don't we do this? I think we're pretty close to the only challenge that we have, I think, is that we're pretty close to the time that we have. So I think we had maybe one last question we can take here. If we could just take over here to the right. And please please be as quick as possible, because we have very limited time. And what I'm going to do afterwards is ask each one of our participants for a final word.
Okay, then I'll read them to be fast. Elena Dragalin, Moldova Aid and organizer of Moldovan American Convention. On July 26, 2018, the Parliament passed a fiscal reform package that allows previously undeclared income and assets to be legalized after paying a tax of only 3%. Combined with an existing law that sells Moldovan citizenship for only 100,000 euros in cash or 250,000 in investments, aren't you concerned, Mr. Candu, that this could legitimize theft and corruption, turning Moldova into a haven for money laundering? And this was actually Corina's question, but was not answered. And of course, I'll ask one more. On June 26, 2018, the Parliament registered the Bill 2017 on diaspora's equal voting rights. Will you personally support this bill, and why, yes or no? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, the citizenship versus, the investments versus citizenship, this is a program which is part of so-called golden business package. It's a golden visa regime, which is used by many countries in the region. This is something which Cyprus, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, countries in the region are doing, and I don't see anything wrong with that if you have a very good system of check and balance, but checking the integrity of that person who applies, the source of income, and you work with international stakeholders and you work with international partners who has this experience. In the world, there are 3 or 4 big international companies, and the government have organized an international competition, and one of these companies won and will help the government to set up the system, filters as well, to work with Reuters, WorldCheck, and other international big players in order to secure, so that one who comes to apply investing in Moldova and getting the citizenship It's really clean. It's reputable. Does not have any bad backgrounds and things like that. And I think country needs the possibility needs to show and to set up an opportunity for the wealthy investors to come to really invest 250,000, which is returnable, or 100,000 non-returnable, which will go in a special fund. The most important, what the government is going to do with those money, how to manage. This is a question mark, which is about the efficiency and strategically to target the investments, particularly in as other countries have done it in the infrastructure or others. So this is important. As about the so-called voluntary declaration of assets, or called amnesty, they are not related. They are not related at all, because the declaration of assets is for the Moldovan citizens first already. It's not. It's for those who you know very well what is the reality in Moldova, and I will give you only one example. The real estate in Moldova, in majority of the cases, 80% of the real estate is under the value, under the market value. This is done because the taxpayers, the owners, did not want to pay the tax. So the tax base is shrinked. Based on this law, the voluntary declaration of assets, there is a possibility for those who came with a document that a flat costs $1,000 to come and to come with the assessment and to indicate the real value, the real market value of that flat or the house, paying 2 or 3% indeed from the difference, from the gain. And at the end of the day, ultimately we will have assets with a real value. The tax base will widen, and we will have better taxation and the revenues for the country.
You're not concerned that a drug dealer from somewhere else in the world could buy the citizenship for 100,000 in cash, and then bring more money in cash, pay 3%, and legalize the money?
No, because first of all, the drug dealer will never apply, because it has to go through international big companies and filters like Reuters and others. First. Second, this product, this citizenship or investments versus citizenship, it's not yet working. Now we are working with international partners to set up all the systems. It will start be workable, operational, only in the new year, after January, February month. Declaration of assets starts to work from November to January. That's it.
Why don't we do this? So let Anders, and then we're gonna wrap up. If you want to stick around and follow up on it, we can. But we do have a time limit.
Yeah, briefly, pioneers in this are the United States and the United Kingdom. So I think it's $500,000 you need to put up in order to get a U.S. green card and then citizenship. There are currently, I think, 11 EU countries that have this system. And the European Commission has recently come out strongly against it for the reason that you suggest. And also the countries that have it particularly, it's Cyprus and Malta. And they have caused very considerable problems. So I think that this is something that there will be an internationally thinking of, but it's mainly the countries with Anglo-American law that have developed the tradition of selling citizenship. And this is connected with secret ownership. So with demands for higher transparency, I think that there will be substantial reason to rethink this practice. I've been involved in Latvia that is now thinking of going around. They introduced it in 2009 in the midst of a financial crisis. And they got a lot of wealthy Russians and Chinese that they later on are not quite sure if they would like to have there.
And just important comment on the declaration of assets. The law strictly prohibits the application of this procedure for those who were in the official positions or they are currently in the official positions, starting from 2009 until today. First. Second, all those involved in the fraud or potentially involved, which are under investigation or will be under the investigation, the fraud in the banking sector, they cannot benefit from the law because the law will not be applicable for them.
Thanks. Why don't we do this? We're gonna. I want to ask all of our speakers for a final word, and Andres, we'll start with you, and we'll go all the way and end with Tim.
I just say that I think that the way forward is very much to stick to the European integration. The trade is going now. Much of the economic stabilization has been done. What's important now is two things: develop a rule of law and the democratic practices.
Just very shortly, as I was mentioning before, there are achievements definitely which we will have to keep on going and going. And there are still challenges and I would say even failures in some of the areas which this government and the next government after the election should focus on, and to speed up the processes related to some very difficult tasks like reforms in the judicial system, and not only. And the future of the country will definitely be at the stake when it's about the human capital, and therefore human capital in education should be the priority for the human capital, justice or the rule of law, and the infrastructure. These are the three priorities for any of the governments in the future for the next period.
Just to reinforce that, I think we're all in agreement that Moldova's path should be towards European integration. I think I hope everyone on this podium agrees with that. But I do have to recognize that the Moldovan government and Moldovan authorities have an uphill battle with a pretty deep and widespread perception that the main drivers of reform are actually Moldova's development partners and not so much Moldovan politicians and Moldovan elites. And I think it will take a lot of effort in Chișinău and through reforms to change that perception. And I think, again, just to reinforce, the first step in that is depoliticizing the judiciary and some of the other key, not just law enforcement institutions, but other oversight authorities, including in the economic sector.
Thank you. I think we're all here because we care about Moldova, and I have a lot of criticisms, but I think one thing I should comment or make a note of is that this government has, despite some disagreements at times, they do always, they're always open to dialogue, they're always open to hearing our thoughts. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that. I do appreciate that because that's not always the case in a lot of countries. So I think open dialogue is really important. And just lastly, I think, as we've said, the upcoming February elections are really important, and yeah, looking forward to seeing what happens. Thank you.
Well, again, I want to thank all of our speakers for this conversation, and I think I agree with Tim, which is I think everyone up here wants the best for Moldova, for the Moldovan people, and reiterate the point that for many of us want to see Moldova fully integrated into the Euro-Atlantic community, prosperous, secure, but there's obviously some very different opinions about what's currently taking place, and we do appreciate the open conversation that we had here today, and we want to thank everybody for joining us, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the questions, but hopefully you'll get to ask some of these questions afterwards or in between or at the next event at the Atlantic Council. So if you can just join me in thanking our speakers for coming here today.